Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and in this video we're going to be considering a very specific chord progression. And if you've ever read a textbook on writing harmony using chords, you may well have come across this piece of advice. Always avoid using chord 4 after chord 5. Well, is that a bad idea? Why should we avoid doing that? Well, that's what we're going to have a look at. And we're going to consider, well, are there circumstances in which we might be okay using chord 5 followed by chord 4? Let's see where this takes us. First of all, just a little bit of background in case there are people here not quite sure what I mean by chord 5, chord 4. Well, we're in the key of C major just because it's nice and easy not to worry about having to use sharps and flats and so on. Here is a scale of C major. C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. And above each of these notes, I'm going to put a third and a fifth. So on that first one, I've got C at the bottom, or the root of that chord. E is a third above it, 1, 2, 3, and G is a fifth above it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So all these triads have a root note from the scale and a third and a fifth above each of those notes. So here we go with the next one, and then we're on to this one. And you notice that when you write these things down, you end up with 3 consecutive lines or 3 consecutive spaces. So that just ensures that you've written the right notes. When we label chords or triads, we do that in Roman numerals just because we use numbers for other things. You know, we put numbers to say bar numbers, bar number 5, or use your third finger here, or this group of notes is a triplet or something. So if we see Roman numerals, then we're not confused with any of that. We know we're talking about chords. So we simply number off like this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We don't use number 8 because the notes of this C, E, G are the same as the notes of this C, E, G. So it's a return to chord 1. So we go up to 7, then we go back to 1 again. And each of these triads is giving us the notes that we need to use a chord. So if I want to use chord 4, I know in C major that chord 4 is F, A, C, F, A, C, but I could use F, A, C in any other order. So you see I've got F, F again, A, C. Or I could do it like this: F, A, C, F again. And I can have as many different voices as I want. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I've got F, C, F, C, F, A. You can double up these notes. That's how you turn the triads into chords. Often in real pieces of music, we have chords in 4 parts. Not always, but often that's the case. So we're just taking the 3 notes of the triad, we're doubling up on one of those notes and turning it into whatever spread we want from the original triad. If you come from a different kind of musical tradition, which is absolutely great, you might think, oh, well, I've never seen all these Roman numerals before, but I have seen this: C, D minor, E minor, F, G, A minor, B diminished, and obviously back to C again. So if you're used to reading chords off a lead sheet, well, you'll know that way of doing it. If you're a guitarist, you'll know that way of doing it. But it's just so you can see, well, how does one system relate to another? Okay, well, going directly onto this question then about chord 5 followed by chord 4. What's the problem? Well, I've tried to spin an example of 5 followed by 4 into 4 parts. What does it sound like? It sounds like this. Does that sound like a bad idea to you? Or do you think, actually, that's the best chord progression I've ever heard? This is a problem. A lot of this boils down to somebody's individual taste. You know, do you like the sound of this? Do you not like the sound of this? I think a much bigger thing to think about is the question of context. But what's the style of the piece? What's the mood of the piece? What's going on before these 2 chords? What's going on after these 2 chords? Those are the big deals, really. But there are some legitimate objections that these textbook writers are raising, and I just want to explore those, and then you can evaluate those yourself. One issue is when we're writing, particularly 4-part harmony, well, we're trying to avoid writing consecutive fifths, consecutive octaves, or you might know them as parallel fifths, parallel octaves. What do I mean by that? Well, if I have an octave between two voices followed by another octave between the same two voices, that's considered to be consecutive octaves or parallel octaves. If I have a perfect fifth between two voices followed by a perfect fifth between the same pair of voices, that's consecutive fifths, parallel fifths. They have to be perfect octaves or perfect fifths. And if you're not sure what I mean by that, then we've got other resources out there to help you that explain about intervals, and you might want to just have a look at that on another occasion. Okay, so have I got a problem here with any of these consecutives or parallels? Well, the answer to that is I sure have. Let's have a look at what the difficulties might be. The bass line is going from G to F. The alto line is also going G, F. So that's giving me consecutive octaves between the alto and the bass, G, F. So that's not great news. I've also got consecutive fifths between the soprano and the alto part, because G to D is a perfect fifth, F to C is a perfect fifth, so I've got consecutive fifths. I've also got consecutive fifths between the soprano part and the bass part. So we've got this G to D again, even though it's an octave and a fifth, but sometimes known as a compound fifth, it's still the same thing, followed by that other fifth. You can hear it sort of sounds a bit clunky, doesn't it? Now, if you're going to say to me, well, I write these consecutive fifths and consecutive octaves all the time, great. If it fits with your piece and your style of writing, well, no problem. But if you're writing in a style that kind of generally speaking avoids all this stuff, when they come along, they kind of stick out. The ear picks them up, and you think, even if you don't hear the consecutives, you sometimes think, oh, there's something that doesn't sound as good as it could there. So it's not necessarily that it sounds awful. It's just that you sort of think, I'm sure maybe a different arrangement of the notes or some different choice of chord might be a better idea there. So this is what this is really flagging up. So if you use this progression that I've written here, this 5-4 thing, and you're thinking, what I don't like is these fifths, these octaves, you know, it's kind of like, yeah, that's not so good, is it? Is there something else you could do? Well, you could go 5-6. Because if you are actually trying to harmonize a melody that goes D followed by a C, the question is, if you're thinking 5-4 doesn't sound too good to me, well, any note in your melody will feature in 3 chords, because you've got 3 notes in each of these triads down here, haven't you? So this C, for example, will be the root of one chord, the third of another, the fifth of another. So we know that C is in chord 1, C is in chord 4, and C is in chord 6. So if you were writing D to C in the melody, and then you've kind of started by writing 5-4 or G to F, and you're thinking, oh, I'm not sure about that. Well, think about your 2 alternatives, 5-6, or a G major to A minor chord, or 5-1, a G major chord followed by a C major chord. Now, either of those, 5-6, 5-1, will probably sound better than 5-4. Because you can hear that kind of everybody sliding down the wall stuff. So it's not impossible to write 5-4. It's not impossible that it's a sound that you're thinking, well, you know, I'm quite happy with that. But if you are going to do it, well, the question is, can you get rid of these consecutives? Well, you might be able to do something like this if you're in charge of the melody. I say that because you might be taking somebody else's melody and reharmonizing it. But if you're in charge of it, well, one thing you could do would be to do this, which means that you haven't got those outer parts moving in the same direction. They're now going in contrary motion, which is not a bad idea. And then we could possibly be in with a shout of avoiding some consecutives by doing something like that, because now you can see that, you know, we haven't got those consecutives there. We've got a fifth followed by a sixth between those two parts. We've got a third followed by a fourth there, so that's good. Between these two parts, we've got a sixth followed by a sixth, so that's fine. Here we've got a third followed by a fifth. So we are managing to go 5-4 without using those consecutives or parallels. And because we've got that contribution, it does sound better, because the first one that we started with, full of consecutives, you can hear everybody sliding down together. Now, because we've got contribution, that progression is much stronger. We can hear the independence of the parts. So that's, you know, an interesting answer to the textbooks that say, whatever you do, never write 5-4 because you'll always end up with parallels or consecutives. Well, there's an example of how we can go 5-4 without ending up with that, and how in certain contexts, maybe that's okay. But it is really saying, employ this progression 5-4 with caution, because you're very likely to end up with this problem of consecutives. So if you're going to use it, well, use with care, so you end up with some contribution if you can, especially between the top and the bottom. That will help you to mitigate that. And as I say, it's all about context. I mean, if you go 5-4 and then you go 5-1, oh, sounds all right, doesn't it? Really, it's not such a sin to do that. So, you know, this is the great thing about rules. It's kind of, some of these rules are a bit fixed, but many of these rules are just advice. You know, they've been written by people who said, well, you know, whenever you try to do this, you normally end up with a bit of trouble like this. But if you can kind of find a way around it, well, you know, okay, but watch out, make sure you can actually do that. So what I've just written there is what you see down here, and so you can see how that's come out. You might be able to organize it in a slightly different way. You know, if you want to organize those parts differently, well, in this version I've got the tenor and the bass parts the same, but I've put what was the alto part in the soprano part, what was the soprano part on the alto part. You know, does that work? And again, it depends what your melody notes are. If they're D to F, well, there's a solution. If it's G to A, there's a solution. Not impossible to do. What I would say is that 5-4 is not a good progression at a cadence point. So if you're at the end of a phrase, you don't really want to go 5-4, because think about what the most common cadences are, things like 5 followed by 1. Well, in this case that we started with, if that were the end of a phrase, I'd be saying, well, 5-1 is going to feel like a bit of musical punctuation. It's the kind of musical full stop, and then we can go on to the next phrase. So it's going to be much stronger than going 5-4. It doesn't really kind of bring you to the end of something. It leaves you kind of in mid-air, doesn't it? So I wouldn't use 5-4 at the end of a phrase for that reason. If you've got a cadence, you're going 5-1 or 4-1 or something to 5 or 5-6. Those are the kind of standard things to do. So if you've got 5-4, think, hang on a minute. Do I really want to go 5-1 or 5-6? Because that's going to be a more solid cadence. If you're mid-phrase and you can deliver this in a way that sounds good in the context of what comes before it and what comes after it, and you can do it in such a way that you haven't got consecutives, well, there we are. It's perfectly possible to do it. Strangely enough, if you reverse this, going from 4 to 5, that is actually quite a standard thing to do, because 4 followed by 5 is one version of an imperfect cadence, going 4 to 5. Again, you've got to be very careful you don't end up with those consecutives, but because you're finishing on 5, It's a kind of musical comma if we're using this punctuation analogy. So 4 to 5 is a recognized cadence. So it's going to be much more commonly used that way round. 4 to 5, often much stronger than going 5 to 4. So those are the issues that surround the discussion as to why often the advice is to avoid going 5 followed by 4. So I'm not saying that's kind of written in stone, so never do it. I am saying if you do it with caution. Consider these issues that we've talked about. Are you at a cadence? Are you going to sprinkle the score with consecutives or parallels? If you can avoid doing that and it sounds really good in the context, well, there's no particular reason to use 5 followed by 4. But the textbooks kind of cite this as something to avoid simply because in most tonal music, in the kind of Western tradition post 1600, it's a progression that is generally speaking avoided. So I hope that's a helpful little exploration of why that advice is often given and what you might be able to do in interpreting that advice. Well, if you found this video helpful, let me point you to the Music Matters website, www.mmcourses.co.uk. When you get onto the website, you'll find we've got lots of resources available to you, and you might find that that's really helpful stuff to look at. One of the things we've got there are courses. So if you click on courses, you'll be able to find a vast array of material there. If you're sort of using chord progressions, writing chords, and you're kind of hearing these in your head, but you're not quite sure how to write them down, that can be a big frustration. You might find it helpful to have a look at our oral dictation course. The oral dictation course, it kind of sounds very academic, but it's really practical. And what it's doing is it's starting with rhythms, then melodies, then 2 parts, 3 parts, 4 parts and beyond. And it's really training your ear to hear things and then write them down, so that when you get to the point of writing your song, your piece of music, whatever it is, you hear things in your head and you're thinking, what am I hearing? How do I write that down? That course would really enable you to be able to do that. Or if you're playing an instrument and you just want to know what's going on by looking at the music, well, it's really going to help you to do that. So it really is about kind of chord intelligence and relating what we hear to what it looks like on the page. So really useful for composers, really useful for performers. And that's a particular course you might want to look at. But lots of other courses there, lots of other exciting things on the website, www.mmcourses.co.uk.